Okay, so welcome back to the fifth and final part of our online lecture, where we're discussing social media research. So in the last section, we talked a lot about qualitative research and qualitative research methods, things like ethnography and interviews and observation. But now we're switching to the quantitative social media research method. So quantitative is about counting things; it's about numbers. So what we're interested in, one thing we can do is monitoring and tracking. So we can choose, for example, appropriate keywords, and focus on basic questions like how many times was a search term found, when was it found, where was it found, and who mentioned the search term. So we can see how popular something is and who's actually talking about it just by counting instances of that term. And what we're often interested in is this idea of sentiment. So how people feel about things. And what we're really interested in is the process by which, we can computationally identify and categorize opinions. So, we have a piece of text, so which in the last section would have been qualitative, but we can actually, use quantitative methods to make inferences about people's sentiment. So what we're really interested in people's attitude towards a topic or a product. We can determine whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. So, often if you're in a canteen, you'll see these emoticon smiley faces that are asking for opinion. But we can actually look through people's tweets or texts or whatever and determine how they feel about things. Something to remember, though, when we're doing this is Poe's law. And that Poe's law states that without a winking smiley or other blatant display of humour, it's impossible to create a parody of fundamentalism that someone won't mistake for the real thing. So if I, for example, tweeted or posted on Facebook something about believing the earth was flat, and I was trying to make a joke, somebody would take me serious and think I was foolish. Now, this particularly applies to anything to do with religion, but it can be applied to politics, business, most aspects where people miss humour or don't understand. Especially among Irish people who say no when they mean yes, and yes when they mean no, and are a stop when they mean go on. So here's an example of a tweet that was posted, as basically a parody, but it got 253 people retweeting it and thousands of comments where people getting really upset. And it's just sometimes it's actually difficult to know whether people are being humorous or not being humorous. So it's a real challenge in applying quantitative techniques to text data. So what sentiment analysis is about, considering how people feel about something. So it's a fairly simple. The process is simple. A lot of the techniques behind it are actually quite complex. So what you have to do is fetch, crawl, and cleanse. So we go out and we gather all this data from around the internet, and then we extract what's the entities of interest, and then we extract some sentiment, and we aggregate the raw data into a summary. So, all this data on its own isn't of any value unless we can actually bring it together and make it into something sensible. So, the challenges around that sentiment analysis is, how accurate are we at gauging sentiment with automated tools? If people are being sarcastic or using slang that isn't in our model, will we be accurate? So we've got cultural factors. Irish people's tendency to find it almost impossible to pay anybody a compliment. We've got linguistic nuances. So people can, subtle differences in language in different countries and the different context. So we have to actually define a sentiment dictionary and the words, that are in it. And so you'll have words that are in widespread usage in Ireland that wouldn't be used, say, in England. And we need, really accurate categorical data to make better use of the data we have. So, another approach is content analysis. So that allows us to identify the presence of particular concepts within qualitative data sets. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give a couple of very brief examples of Google Trends. So here's something where we can actually see when back in 2015 we could actually look at, based on searches, when Conor McGregor was actually fighting. And what you actually see is you have these peaks around particular fights, and this was this kind of smaller trough was when he just said something insane or crazy, trying to build up to a thing. But we can actually look at we can look at a particular search topic and see how often it appears and spikes around certain things. And people have used that for things like predicting the outbreak of flu epidemics. So as people Google sniffly nose, like I have at the moment, you know, as large numbers of people do that, it actually is a predictor that there's a flu epidemic about to break. So this is the Kardashians. So what we actually see is that some time ago we reached peak Kardashian back in 2014. So people may have forgotten who the Kardashians are by now. This was, you know, this particular spike was when she did a cover for a magazine, and the headline was that Kim breaks the internet. You see this massive spike in interest. So here we are, is looking at whether this can actually be used to predict what's happening next. And here we see how search terms for flu were actually relatively accurate in predicting the occurrence of the outbreak of flu outbreaks. So, you know, as more and more people started, as small numbers of people started catching the flu, they start Googling, and, you know, each person with the flu passed it on to several other people. So the actual increase in activity looking for flu as a search term tells us that in a couple of days' time we're going to have a flu epidemic. Okay, so then we move on. Kind of the last topic for today is talking about common errors and biases associated with social media research. And there is kind of a bit of a danger when people are using fancy techniques and whatever, that they can rely on the technology, and the fundamental science that's underneath it isn't particularly good. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this module is get across theory and critical thinking, as opposed to just how to, you know, as opposed to techniques themselves. So because the techniques will come and go out of fashion, whereas the ability to actually understand how they work will translate to whatever technologies come next. We're talking about you know, what goes wrong in social media. This is a really, really important one to show that just because something is popular on social media doesn't necessarily mean it's useful. So this is the Emma Moore research scandal. So if anybody has been following debates around the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, this is where it actually occurred. And so it is a scandal, but not in the way people who oppose vaccines actually believe. So what actually happened was, you know, back in 1998, The Lancet, which was an extremely prestigious medical journal, published a story linking the MMR vaccine with autism. Very controversial study, had a huge impact, declining rates of vaccine uptake. But when we actually look at the research itself, so there was a sample size of 12, which is tiny. The data was actually faked, so symptoms around these 12 people were actually made up. Of the 9 children where there was supposedly some evidence of symptoms, only one of them actually had the symptoms that were claimed in the study. So they massaged data to change times. The patients that were recruited to participate in it were done through were recruited through organisations that were opposed to the use of the vaccine in the first place, and the people were biased. There was a group in America that were planning to take litigation against the MMR, and they actually paid for the study, and so they were actually had a vested interest in it producing particular outcomes. And the other thing was that Wakefield himself, who authored the study, had boasted that he could make $43 million a year from diagnostic kits in this new condition that he was talking about. So he intended to make a huge amount of money out of it. So by 2012, once the truth of the paper came out and the fraud and falsehoods that were involved in the research came out, the PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, said that Wakefield's paper was the most cited retracted scientific paper. So it was the biggest paper in the history of science to be pulled, and it was retracted for fraud. But the consequences of it, now what we're seeing is the upsurge in measles cases. So most of the people in this class will have never experienced or seen measles, but before the vaccines became widespread in Ireland, a lot of children got vaccines, and a lot of people died as a result of measles. It's a very serious illness. But what happens? So Wakefield was struck off the medical register in the UK. He's considered to be a fraudster, but he's used social media in the United States to rebuild himself. So he's kind of, similar to kind of Trump's model. He's actually reached out to people who feel very frustrated and irritated about society, and he's kind of got this hero status among certain groups. But social media has provided him a platform. So while the existing medical science literature rejects what he's done, he passes his pseudoscience off on social media, and this is the kind of the lesson or the warning for people is that when we talk about biases, people think I'll conduct my own research and I'll go onto the internet, I'll go onto social media. But the problem is there's something called confirmation bias that people suffer from, and when they actually find a link that agrees with or something that backs up what they actually believe, they tend to accept it as true. So that's an example of where social media provides people with a lot of fake or false news and spurious information. But the thing to watch out for are things like when you're conducting research, you can have coverage errors and sample errors. So you may not cover all the components of a population, and that can be a sampling error. So you collect from a subset. So the UK general election opinion polls failed to predict the result. And one of the reasons for that was they used a large amount of internet polling. So they completely underrepresented the number of pensioners in their samples. And pensioners, older people, tended to be more conservative. So they this is for the for the previous general election. And for this one, then they missed out on students voting because they assumed that students weren't going to vote. So they actually, in two general elections, they made different errors in different directions. So you can have a non-response bias. So the people who don't actually respond to the survey might be significantly different from those that don't. So again, this is in politics, this is very possible. What you have is what sometimes they call the shy Tory or the shy Conservative voters. So people who may be more right-wing than the media, and feel nervous about disclosing their views for fear of ridicule, won't actually participate in surveys. And then, so I think that actually is where we're going to wrap it up for today. So we've talked through, about social media metrics and different things. Once again, I've said if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch by Twitter or use Moodle, any means possible. This is the first time I've done an online video cast like this. I hope you found it somewhat useful. I would remind you that the information in this class is examinable in the MCQ, so it's important you go through it. If there's anything you feel I haven't explained properly, do ask questions. I look forward to seeing you again next week, and thank you very much for paying attention. Best of luck.